Yeah, very excited about the device group today. And maybe just 1 or 2 sentences about me. My name is Simon. I'm the head of customer success at Workpath, and I essentially work with all the Workpath customers together with a team of customer success managers and coaches, and essentially we're accompanying organizations at the implementation stage as well as professionalization and scaling of the OKR process, and very much trying to really integrate the process into the existing landscape, not only tool landscape, but especially process landscape of organizations leveraging OKRs. You might be familiar with Workpath. Workpath is a Munich-based software as a service organization that helps organizations to better execute their strategy. And we do so by leveraging OKRs, essentially getting from your long-term strategy to actual results. While this is the core, something that has come more and more relevant over the last 2 years, and something that's quite interesting today in today's session as well, is the fact that we're heavily focusing on the analytics aspect of it. And this has very much to do with being able to analyze where you stand with the process and to continuously basically adapt and improve in how you execute your strategy and how you essentially leverage OKRs in your organization. So happy to also get any questions on that. And for now, I would say we're just gonna dive into the topic. If you have any questions in terms of functionality, how to use the Q&A, I do have another colleague with me today that you might already know. Teresa is with me, and you can drop also questions in the chat if you are unclear about something. Maybe one last information before we start out: we will be sharing the presentation, some follow-up material, as well as the recording of today's session. So we can very much focus on the session and don't have to be taking too many notes, I hope. All right, so what is our goal of today's session? On the one hand side, we would like to jointly understand what you can measure and assess in terms of the quantitative as well as qualitative aspects of looking at the OKR process. So taking those both angles, of course, that's a topic that we're trying to cover today. Additionally, we would like to learn how to find the relevant information, right? Like, it's not just about understanding what could be measured, but really also about how do you get that type of data, and to actually be able to measure, no matter if it's a quantitatively measuring or qualitative assessment, to see if you're making progress or not. And of course, we would like to share some questions and answers on how to assess also the impact of OKRs in the organization, right? We're usually looking at how does the OKR process, or if you want to call it more generically, the strategy execution process of your organization, like what does that look like? How is that performing? Is it performing in the way you would like to? And then, of course, if you're introducing methodologies and processes into an organization, there's always a question like, well, does this actually have an impact on the success itself of our organization? And that's something we would also like to get some questions from you, but also share a few insights on that as well. So I'm not going to do an OKR introduction today on the framework. I do always highlight these 2 first slides in the beginning if you might be very new with it. In a nutshell, OKRs are about executing your strategy, and it's essentially a goal-setting framework that very much fits quite well for a lot of organizations with the way they're working currently, the way they have transformed over the last 5 years in a lot of ways. So it really fits neatly with the agile transformation and working in an agile world, because it, on the one hand, very clearly enables you to execute the strategy in a top-down and bottom-up fashion, but it doesn't do it in a way that's too rigid, right? So it very nicely fits with a lot of the principles that you might have introduced on the team level. So if you're in a software development team, for example, if you introduce Scrum and the principles behind that, a lot of autonomy, OKRs very neatly adapt to that, and like can nicely be connected to that. And of course, the core is obviously the goals, where you have the 2 components of objectives and key results. And essentially, you are building an infrastructure where you have goals that contribute to each other, to really have a hypothesis system to go into the next cycle to see if you can achieve your strategy long term. And then, of course, next to the goal itself, the OKRs and the structure, we have the strategy cycle, Also here, we are going to be diving into the specifics. This is a best practice we usually bring into organizations. And both of those items, looking at the OKRs as well as the OKR process, are obviously very important angles to look at when you're in the process of trying to figure out, like, is this working well for us? Are we making progress, etc.? So we would like to ask you 2 questions. And the first question, we would kindly ask you to use the chat that you've used already. And for the second one, you will have a pop-up on your screen where you can just click. So the first question we would like to get some insights from you is if you're currently measuring the progress or success of your OKR process in your organization. So you should have a pop-up right now, and I would kindly ask you just to click on this to get a quick insight. All right, lots of people already clicking. Excited. So we have 30 out of 60 people that clicked, 40. All right, this is going very quickly. Great. So I'm going to start analyzing a little bit while it's like ramping up and get very close to 100%. We have 47 out of 57 right now who clicked. So we have 45% who are not measuring it at the moment, which is absolutely to be expected. We have 20% who measure in a qualitative way or like assess in a qualitative way. 12% measure quantitatively. And 24% actually do both. So this is quite a big share of organizations that are joining today that are actually measuring, and even like the biggest part of them actually doing both of them at the same time. Great, thank you so much. So this is a great insight. So let's jump to the second question. In your opinion, what is the most important metric, if you have one, if you know one, to measure the success of your OKR implementation? And for this one, I would ask you to share your insights in the chat that you've just used for the introduction. So just drop your thoughts on what is a relevant or even most important metric in your way. All right, so perfect. We have the first one coming in from Dominic. Hi, Dominic. Teams regularly checking their OKRs and updating. Great. Yeah, we're gonna follow up on that one in a second. We have Yazia saying somehow measure the mindset change. Great. Thanks so much. All right, let's say I'll wait a few more seconds. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. All right, Philip shared topics of our strategy actually implemented on a broad scale. Great, so execution of your strategy. Linda shared aligned objectives across the organization. Thank you so much. Alignment score. Improvement in the org alignment was shared by Yazia. Yes, organizational alignment. Great. Johanna Specht shared there is setting focusing compared to before. So this is really about the impact of your OKRs. Priyana shared regular meetings to measure the progress. Lena shared we're using an OKR tracker, and based on the progress, we're able to see a lot of acceptance. Great, thank you so much for sharing this. Michael shared seeing how deep all teams members engage in a drafting session. Great, so in the drafting of the OKRs already. Kuchmiet shared project output, improvement, people motivation. Guillermo, percentage of organization use. Strategy alignment was shared by Yao. Great, yeah, thank you so much. Those were already amazing examples, and maybe you can get some inspiration from your counterparts in other organizations. And I would say, yeah, for now, thank you so much. If you have any additional ones and you are typing them down, feel free to check them out, and we're going to take a look at them afterwards. And Marcus had one more, implementing in sales org, so change of mindset. Great, thank you so much, Marcus. All right, I would say let's dive into the first part, and we'd be happy to check back in the chat if you have any additional things to share. So maybe zooming out a little bit, why is it so important to look at the aggregated data of the OKR implementation? Therefore, you have your own motivation, I would assume. So the key things that we see is that on the one hand side, organizations really care about evaluating the process itself. And the reason that is if you don't have any target metrics, if you don't like set a goal on how to use a methodology or process, it's very much obviously in a vacuum. So you can't really, make any progress. And that's kind of an essential thing that a lot of organizations just expect from doing OKRs or any other process. And one of the key things also is this is not about doing OKRs, right? Like this is about having a consistent and effective, successful process from going from your long-term strategy, going from your mission and vision to actually delivering value to customers and driving business value subsequently. So having a way to measure the effectiveness of that is something that's incredibly exciting for a lot of organizations, and something that in most cases was just not possible before a process like OKRs, right? If you have something that you can now track and analyze, you essentially have an infrastructure to continuously develop the organizations. And secondly, of course, this builds on the first one. You have the ability to define and really analyze improvement potentials, right? If there are any opportunities to really improve the process in a certain part of the strategy execution steps that you're taking, and you can really go to individual people, to departments, to leaders in your organization to really help them to analyze the process and to become better, and in many ways take over the role that is somewhat more and more expected from them, right? Like in the leadership roles, there's more expectations not only to manage the execution, but really also, of course, on the one hand, like talk about the vision, where you want to go as an organization, but also keep track on the execution of the strategy. And what's most expected, or like what's coming more and more into these leadership roles, is that the expectation goes very much in the way of that you're enabling the organization, your team, your department, to be successful in executing their strategy. And this has a lot to do with organization development, with detecting improvement potential, and is something that can be very much kind of drawn from the OKR process and used in the leadership role, for example. And last but not least, of course, the motivation aspect is incredibly important here, and not just the general idea of using OKRs to motivate people with a purpose-driven organization, but also just kind of the nature of the OKR process means for a lot of large organizations, it's a step-by-step process, right? Like you might have a blueprint of how you would like to operate long-term, but that might be further away from your existing reality of doing that. And by measuring the process, and you essentially enable people to see smaller wins on the way, and that's incredibly important to make it on the one hand successful in general, right? Afterwards, otherwise you might be feeling like, well, this takes forever and we're not really making progress if you're not measuring. And of course, really managing the motivation and frustration level of teams and leaders in the organization. If we're talking about ways of collecting data, there are probably quite obviously two ways, but I do want to mention them. On the one hand side, we have quantitative analysis, and of course, we're building a lot around that with the analytics functionality I was referring to at the introduction. So this is really about getting the actual data from your process, and some of the things that you already mentioned could be those data points, right? Like, are people active? Are they drafting goals? Are those goals aligned? And all of those aspects. And there are different ways to get that data. Of course, you can, if you are in let's say in an earlier phase, you have a smaller rollout, you're doing this in Excel or Google spreadsheets, you can also find ways to measure that out of there. It's maybe not as convenient, but you can do that. And then, of course, for larger solutions, it very much becomes about extracting data from the database itself of a solution. And then on the right-hand side, of course, qualitative analysis. And this is not only like an alternative if you can't measure it quantitatively, but it's an incredibly exciting way to add to the data from the left-hand side, right? Because you get more insights from the people, how they feel about the process, and you have a lot of additional opportunities that go more into the things that you can't really measure. excuse me, and things you can't measure might be things of like, what is actually the impact of your process, right? You might care about like, does this have an impact on our, so if you try to become more customer focused with the OKR process, maybe you care about your net promoter score, right? Like, but it will be very hard or next to impossible to really prove the connection between the OKR process and the impact of on that business level, on the KPI level. But asking the teams and how they perceive it is one way to close that bridge and to really get closer to measuring that. All right, so I'm just watching what's in the chat right now. If you have any general clarification questions or like general questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A format, but we will obviously later also monitor the chat. But if you know where the functionality is, we'd be happy to get questions in the Q&A, of course. Yeah, so how can you measure the success of your OKRs in a quantitative way? We would like to just get a few insights in that. So some of the best practices that we see in how organizations structure this and how we work with organizations to introduce this on a quantitative level, especially if you're looking into the first or second year of leveraging OKRs, which I think very much fits with the group that joined today based on your introduction, are basically in those 4 categories, right? So we talk about the setup, so everything that's like preparation of preparing your organization to leverage the OKR process. Then we look at planning alignment, so that's something that you're familiar with based on the OKR process, right? So the OKR drafting phase, the alignment, etc. The engagement part is in part like where we actually in the execution, right, in the phase between kickoff and the end of the cycle, where you are looking at, well, how does the organization actually engage with the OKR process? And quality and execution is one thing you can also take an angle at that a lot of organizations quite strongly care about, and is something that yeah, we also like to focus on. So giving a few examples on these, obviously you can do this till infinity, and the setup. Things we usually care about is like, have you actually trained the multipliers, right? Like, do you have teams that are being coached by a trained OKR coach? Do you have people that are trained in the methodology to be those coaches? Do you have people, if you're using a tool, did people have an initial introduction? And those are obviously very basic things to look at, but they are very, very much things that you can help your program lead and OKR coach team to essentially see, do we have the basics to be successful with this or not? Planning and alignment, you already shared a lot of insights as well. So some of the basics or best practice that you would use in the first, let's say in the first couple cycles, you definitely want teams to have OKRs, right? Like percentage of teams with OKRs is an interesting thing to look at. You definitely want alignment to work in a basic way already in the beginning. So do you have the top level OKRs for your organizations? Do they have support or not? So you shared some insights also about the alignment aspect. So that very much goes in that direction. In terms of the engagement, you want OKRs to be updated. And I think we had some comments on that as well, right? You want as little as possible OKRs that have never been updated. You would probably very much care about people like using the check-in, no matter if it's a functionality or like doing some kind of a rhythm where they look at the OKRs, because that's essentially the only format you have between kickoff and the end of the cycle. And of course, if you have a tool, you probably want to look at weekly active teams to see that. On quality and execution, you in most cases want a trend of OKR progress that goes up cycle by cycle. And many organizations also care about focusing with OKRs, and having a number of OKRs per team that you find to be appropriate is a thing that a lot of organizations also care about. And since we said we would like to take a look at what to measure and what to look at, but also some benchmarks, we wanted to share a few benchmarks on those topics, and you can also obviously look at them later in the presentation. But if we look at the setup phase, looking at share of coached teams, we are shooting obviously for all the teams getting support. So you probably want to go somewhere above 90%. If you have too many teams that have like no support from someone who has training or official training, you're probably going to be struggling much more and just going to be taking longer than you might have to. You can read up later also on some of the intentions there. I think it's quite obvious in most cases. You just want the amount of support that you can get in the beginning. If we're looking at training people in the organizations to do that facilitation role, we're usually looking at 5 to 10%. So 8 to 10% would be a nice target to go for. So this means we usually go for 5 to 8% for OKR coaches, for example, and you're probably also trying to get leadership trainings across in the beginning. And then you have a setup where you can work with, right? Like most organizations to introduce this are trying to not do this with a consultancy in a way that they do it for them for like a long time, but it's really about enabling multipliers in the organization. And then share of users, to use a tool, of course, you at least want to have one person per team who knows how to use it, essentially. When it comes to planning alignment, the benchmarks for the metrics that we've shared, share of teams that have drafted OKRs, there you also, of course, you want 100%, but like you want to get like more than 90% to not let slip through too many teams, because then it just really feels like something that's not, reversible, right? It's just going to be on a new way of setting goals, and there is no way to escape that. Share of top level OKRs, I think that one is, we would say, like, if you don't have organizational goals supported, you definitely are going to be struggling a little bit. So we would probably shoot for 100% there as a benchmark. And looking at some of the other ones, so engagement, share of OKRs updated in the last 4 weeks or a month, a great benchmark would be 3 quarters. Never updated OKRs like in an entire cycle. If you have a good running system where you have people supporting the process, you should aim for 0% there. Prepared check-ins, very similar to updates in the last 4 weeks. So check-ins would be great if that's around 70%. And weekly active teams, something reasonable to shoot for, is definitely above 60%, right? You're not going to look for the same level of engagement as within a Microsoft Teams or Slack application, but it's just, still great to have teams coming in with a check-in at the same time, although it's not as fast-paced as a project management level. So for the last part, like for quality and execution, there are a lot of things to look at, and also OKR quality itself. But for now, the two aspects we shared here, the trend, of course, if you're looking at cycle over cycle, and if you're looking at the achievement of your OKRs, you would like them to be at a great level, but you also would like them to go up a little bit. And this means that teams are engaging more with the OKR process, updating the OKRs in most cases, but they're also getting better and better at assessing what's reasonable, right? Like they can assess like something that they can actually achieve in a cycle. And while you're not trying to be strict on like them achieving 100%, you're trying to make sure that there's actually progress happening, because then you're really seeing if teams are focusing on that, or if their focus is somewhere else on day-to-day tasks that might not be related. Share of teams with appropriate number of OKRs. You can be, if you would like to be very strict on that. So some organizations would like to have no more than 3 OKRs or 4 OKRs per team, something you could just try to assess yourself. So jumping to the next part. So how can you measure the success of your OKRs in a qualitative way, just to get some additional perspective on that? Essentially, you can do a lot about the acceptance of the OKR methodology. And that, of course, has a lot to do with understanding, like, why do you do OKRs in the first place? So in large organizations, so many things have been introduced over the years usually. So you really try to understand if people understand why OKRs are being used in the organization and like what's the purpose behind that, right? That's something you can ask in a survey, for example. You're really trying to understand if the enablement in the first cycles, but also later on, if that's working, if that's effective. That's something that's quite hard to read out of the data. And very importantly, you're trying to understand if the value is being perceived, and if that essentially, if your hypothesis of leveraging OKRs to do something like execute your strategy or getting certain principles in the organization, if that actually has the impact you're anticipating. And probably you don't have to be too hard on yourself there, right? Because it's going to be tough no matter what to introduce something new. But you try to have that discussion, you try to have that feedback loop. And the reason that's also important is the aspect that we introduced earlier. You will have a tough time really proving that OKRs have a positive impact on the top or bottom line. You're going to have a tough time really proving that you increased the net promoter score for your product, for example, but you can have these basically things you can ask in between that give you a pretty good indicator if you're supporting those causes or not on a business level. And in order to do that better, we usually try to look at the OKR process and what the organizations are doing with that with something that we usually refer to as capabilities. So capabilities of an OKR methodology, these are things that you might care about and that are almost automatically driven and pushed by the OKR process, but things you could also additionally very much focus on. So these do not mean that you're taking the process perspective, right? Like, are we planning properly? Are we executing on that plan? Like, are we achieving that or not? But they are taking more the, let's say, the principle, like how we work perspective. And I just want to share a couple of best practices on what organizations look at in this sense. And the 4 ones on this page are some of the key ones we see organizations looking at. One is metric-driven work. So really trying to understand if the organization is becoming more metric-driven, something that you're probably very aware of that's being pushed by OKRs, by kind of like OKRs demanding or asking for key results with metrics, and things you can also very much track also on a quantitative level, but you can definitely also ask on a qualitative level, like, is that impact happening or not? The other ones, purpose-driven work is something you can ask, and these are examples of what you might ask. Focus is a huge aspect. So a lot of organizations struggle with lots of opportunities and challenges to work with, and they're really trying to use OKRs to focus teams and the overall organization, and to have that sometimes painful discussion of, are we really doing the most important things, or are we just overwhelming ourselves and doing nothing really in an amazing way? And collaboration alignment is a huge aspect, cross-team collaboration. So are we effectively working across team boundaries? Is one thing you could also ask for in terms of the capabilities. Some additional things might be transparency, customer focus. So in a lot of ways that you can push this with OKRs, but also ask this. So it's a huge aspect and something that almost any organization that is market focused would care about nowadays. And this is one of those examples where it's going to be tough to prove the impact on the NPS, but if you have a way to keep track of, either in a qualitative or quantitative manner, if on the customer focus of your organizations, and try to make this a little bit more transparent, although it's not a science, of course, at the end of the day, you can say, hey, we really improved customer focus. We've really found customer measures and focused the teams on that. And the teams are much more talking about that now. And that is a great way to also communicate internal success cases to hold up the motivation for your team. Last but not least, continuous learning and team empowerment. A lot of those are not meaty, as someone from a consulting background might say, but they essentially really highlight some of the key things organizations care about when it comes to what they want to achieve with OKRs. All right, so this was the key part of what I wanted to present and what we wanted to bring in terms of best practices. And for now, I would very much like to get some of your questions. And as introduced in the beginning, I would kindly ask you to use the Q&A format in the menu bar of Zoom. If they do end up in the chat, we will also read them, of course. And I would jump into some of those questions, and we will try to get through those. If for any reasons we don't, we would try to follow up on them with the email as well. So anything you care about, very excited to get some of your questions. So I will start out with the Q&A and then check what is in the other part as well. So Alan has been very active. So we have 3 questions by Alan. Thanks a lot for asking questions actively. You said we analyze several dimensions of our implementation. There is not only one metric. Okay, great. Yeah, I think this was also referring back to the question I had initially. Alan also shared one of the most important metrics we see is always how much impact we're bringing in the org. Great. And then there's a question, don't you think using OKRs on a team level as a crutch for a Scrum Kanban done badly is a waste? Let me try to see if I understood the question. So so you're asking if I don't think that using OKRs to kind of replace Scrum or Kanban on a team level is kind of a waste. If I understood your question correctly, the way it's meant is that we're not replacing the way the teams work. So teams might work in a project management process or a product development process like Scrum or Kanban. OKRs are essentially an addition that connects those teams to the long-term strategy, to the overall strategy of the organization and other teams. So essentially, the way the connection there works in all of the organizations we know in that regard is that they essentially try to describe what they want to achieve on a customer level in OKRs and in the QSATs, and their epics basically contribute to that. So absolutely, yeah, I would not recommend to replace the Scrum or Kanban process there. So Dominic has a question. Thanks for asking a question, Dominic. How often do you recommend to run surveys for the qualitative evaluations, and how does this rhythm fit to cycles of 3 to 6 months? So what we most see is either every cycle or every other cycle, and depending on your cycle length, so 3 to 6 months, as you're saying. So I would say what we see most is that you try to integrate this in your OKR process by adding it to the retrospective. And this would mean that you would like to have a survey shortly before the retrospective that you're running in the organization. So maybe you're running team level retrospectives where coaches talk to the teams and learn that. And you have, as part of that, or in addition, an official survey. And then also like a joint retrospective where coaches come together, program lead. And we just see that, you know, it's a great asset to have that feedback there, because then you can really look back, say like, hey, we did great this cycle, we've improved this and that. For next cycle, we're doing a small update to the process if you want to do that. Yeah, and every cycle or every other cycle is probably something that's reasonable, depending on if it's too stressful and how many surveys your teams are already getting if they are overwhelmed with that. But of course, if you can do it every cycle, it's a great asset to really establish, let's say, a habit of continuous organizational development, also establish trust with the teams if you are able to communicate and follow up on them. You probably can't solve all problems, of course, that you might collect in a given cycle. Thanks for your question, Dominic. Lena has a question as well. After introducing OKRs, it would take a few cycles before we get it right. So when would you suggest is a good time to take feedback on success? So we do see some organizations saying, let's take a cycle or two to start and then run the surveys. But I think if you are tailoring the surveys to the stage that you're in, you can start from the very beginning. And it's a great way to show success in the beginning. And in my perception, you can already have wins in the first cycle. And those wins are not going to be that you draft perfect OKR, so you run the cycle perfectly and everybody's happy. But you probably, if teams now need to sit together to define what they want to achieve, you probably increase focus already in the first cycle, or you have more clarity on what other teams are doing. And so if you manage the expectations and not asking too much, I would very much recommend to start at the end of the first cycle already. And in that regard, also, if you would like to have benchmarks from before, which is probably most exciting, you might want to run that as you're starting out with OKRs. So if you still have the time, if you're in that stage, you can ask before you start OKRs and have some of those same principles and capabilities asked again at the end of the first cycle. Thanks for your question, Lena. Wolfgang asks, are there not only OKRs at the team level, but also on the level of each individual? Yeah, thanks for the question. So let's say from generally how OKRs can be used, you can have both. So organizational level OKRs and then team levels on different teams, right? It could be a department. We do know that organizations use individual goals as well. However, like at the customer base that we look at, I don't think we have any customers, or maybe below 2% of customers are using individual goals. And the main reason is that a lot of organizations are really trying to focus on team achievement and autonomy for a team. And a lot of what organizations are trying to do with OKRs is to some extent limited with doing individual OKRs. And the reason is you're trying to, you're trying to pin down what is the impact you want to have on with customers on a team level. And on the one hand side, in most cases, that's collaborative effort. Like in very, very few situations is like individual people driving the actual value on the customer side. And by essentially breaking those down into individual goals, you kind of taking the flexibility to change what's being done on an output level, so below OKRs in the connections on project management level. So you're very much veering over to an output-driven system in many cases, yeah. But of course, you would have to assess it in the individual situation. Thanks for your question, Wolfgang. We have another question by Alexander. Is it possible to combine OKRs with Hoshinkanri? So I'm not an expert with Hoshinkanri. I've read up on it. I know a few things on it, but my understanding is that it would be rather unusual because they are rather competing. I don't want to say competing, but they're like doing this a similar thing, and not in the same way as OKRs and Scrum. With OKRs and Scrum, it's like on a team level, defining what you're actually doing to create impact on Scrum and nicely connecting with OKRs. But Hoshinkanri is an alternative to OKRs that I'm just personally not as familiar with. So there might be ways to take our principles from one side to the other, or like adapting your Hoshinkanri approach with OKRs. And in many cases, it's also more similar than one might expect. So you might still be able to run the same software solution. So it's something we've been looking into to supporting also those processes. But yeah, that's my quick thought. Thanks for your question, Alexander. So Yazi asks, what is the best format to use for the weekly check-ins? So they're usually weekly or bi-weekly. For example, if you have a 2-weekly PM or product development process. So on the one hand, you can have software guided solutions, something that we would offer with Workpath. On the other hand, you probably just want a standard structure. And some of the key elements there is like having questions to ask the team, the aspect that they prepared beforehand, and probably most importantly, the habit of in that weekly check-in or bi-weekly check-in, looking at the OKRs, right? You're trying to reflect on what did we set out to do? Are we still on track? Like not only in achieving, but are we actually working towards what we set out to be the focus? So yeah, questions, looking at goals and preparation beforehand. And we'd be happy to share some best practice guides on how to do check-ins that you can do with the software or without afterwards as part of the session. So maybe Teresa, we can take that topic. Thanks for your question, Yazi. So we have 2 more questions in Q&A right now, and then we have someone in the chat, I think. So Ami asked, is OKRs applicable or necessary for businesses which are in first steps? They have no history of data in company. So if OKR in general is applicable for businesses which are in the first steps, so I'm interpreting first steps as like the business has just been started. And I would say, yes, you can do that. The point where you probably will like need it more or most is when you have like multiple teams and you need that alignment across team level. Beforehand, you can probably, you can still use the logic of OKRs of writing what you want to achieve, and they can really help you. But the broader idea of like running this cycle and the OKR cycle and things like that, and like all the formats that probably makes sense if you have a couple teams, right? But how you define the goals and like really instilling that in the organizations, we know a lot of tech companies are starting out that are doing that from the very beginning. Wolfgang, I do see that you raised your hand, but I'm not sure if I can, if you're able to speak in a webinar, so I don't know really how to react. But I'd be happy to get your thoughts in the chat. So Lena asked, there's one more question from Lena in the Q&A. So in a flat and matrix structure, which is with less employees, is it okay to have company level OKRs, then squad level OKRs, and squad level OKRs get shared by all squad team members, not really get down to individual OKRs? Yeah, absolutely. If I understood correctly, so having few levels of OKRs and really a good number of people working towards, like in your case, squad OKRs or any type of team OKRs, and only having 1 or 2 or maximum 3 levels of OKRs and not distributing that on individual level would be something that I would even consider to be a best practice. Yeah, most organizations that we work with trying to stay away from like breaking it down too much. You're really just trying to get to a level where the individual team members have clarity on how to engage in a team, on what to focus on, and you still want to try to distribute ownership, right? Like with OKR owners or Q result owners, or then if you plan initiatives or epics, to have owners for those. But absolutely. So Yazi asked an additional question. What is your opinion on starting OKR adoption in an org by piloting just 1 or 2 teams and then expanding into the remaining teams, rather than starting from org down to teams? So you probably want to have some kind of a relevant starting point to get some of the benefits, right? So having maybe a few more teams than 1 or 2 probably makes sense. So if we talk to large organizations, we usually look into something larger than that. So like a small department, maybe if it's a large company, 100, 200, 300 people. If you're small organizations, I would try to get a few teams to get that idea, like what is the collaboration like across those team boundaries. And in terms of top down versus like bottom up introduction, we've seen both. What we usually try to recommend is some kind of a T structure where you get leaders involved and to draft organizational OKRs and then have one vertical from the organization. It doesn't have to be an org vertical like org structure, but it could be a value stream, and to get the insight or the benefit of both of those, right? Because you're making sure that leaders are adapting to the way of thinking, but you're also kind of like validating, does this make sense? And it doesn't feel like a top-down initiative exclusively. Thanks for your question, Yazia. And I would say I'm going to jump to the chat real quick to see if there are any additional questions, and I do think there are quite a bunch. So perfect. All right. So I have, I'm going to start it in the chat a little bit, and then I did see a question, Christine, as well. So isn't the percentage of coach teams an output rather than an outcome? Yeah, so it's so on a scale of going from output to outcome, this is something that's that is quite close to output. So you have to consider if you want that or not. We do see a lot of organizations doing that because it's a way to pace themselves. But yeah, of course, a better way would be to try to understand like how equipped these teams are and how well supported they are. The problem is a little bit, if you do this before the OKR cycle, you oftentimes have very little time. So that's why it's very output heavy, but I obviously totally agree, Yazia, with your point. So Deborah asks, what kind of specific tool does exist for OKR? Yeah, so of course I'm biased because I chose Workpath as a company to work for, but yeah, Workpath is one way to do that. And of course there are other organizations. What essentially we're focusing on is doing this on an enterprise level for large organizations, really helping integrate this in existing processes to make this as smooth as possible, and the analytics aspect. So the ability to measure success and to take small steps and use this as an organizational development tool. Thanks for your question. Yao asked, design thinking can be applied in each phase of product development, also implementation, I think. Yeah, of course, and data you have from that as well. I absolutely agree. Johanna, general question, how can OKR masters plan the resources for the upcoming quarter to best plan OKRs? Are there any tools, supports, tips? Because OKRs are not meant to be a project plan. Yes, this is a very interesting question and something we've have spent and are still spending a lot of time on analyzing how to best support this. So Johanna asked about how resource planning in general, resource planning in that phase works with OKRs. And essentially what we see teams doing, and we're observing how organizations do this, is they try to map, of course, like, how many resources, do we want to map for a certain value that we are aspiring to do, right? Like we want to drive this type of value with these key results measured. Like what is a reasonable investment from the investment perspective of the resources? We do see, however, that it becomes more practical if teams start like matching this with the actual output they need to plan, right? Because it's really hard to actually assess on the other direction, like what's feasible without planning the output. So what we usually see is teams plan their OKRs. They also pre-plan some of the initiatives they would do. And of course, they can change them afterwards, or epics or whatever they might do. And they try to reflect on what's a reasonable investment in terms of resource investment for this outcome. but also cross-referencing, like what would we need to do? What's our assumption, what we need to do with the outcome? So referencing, like, how does the resource planning work with that? And this is something we will very, very likely introduce also in the software. So something we're preparing and using internal prototypes right now. But it is very exciting. So if you have any experiences with that or questions, very happy also for you to reach out if you want to share your thoughts on that. Yazi has the question, answer to Deborah. Thanks for answering the question. So Yahoo operation is running business, so we need KPI to measure the SLA. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to in this context, Yahoo, but of course you will have KPIs like business KPIs or tableau KPIs that you still will have running, that you're contributing to with OKRs, for example, and sometimes you also have additional health metrics that you're measuring for the ongoing operations. Great, and Philip, I think, also answered the question from Deborah. Thanks a lot, Philip. Yahoo, perfect, thanks for instance. Okay, I think the other ones are mentioned, so I won't be able to read all of those, but we have one more question here that I see, and the one more question in the Q&A format. So there's one question by Alan. Don't you think having too many OKRs can cause a conflict of interest issue, because it will always be more important to close my personal OKRs than those of the team of the company? A matter of survival and promotion, or even, yeah, absolutely. So a few thoughts I have on that is, like, most organizations are trying to stay away from individual OKRs. You try to have as few as OKRs as you can have, if that's possible, to focus the organization, and you're trying to not connect it with promotion, money, and all those things. You're trying to keep it separately from the performance management aspect. Yeah, and I think the last question by Yahoo was already answered, and there's one last question by Christine, and then I will share the follow-up material and how that works. There's one last question by Christine. What is your view on working with both OKRs and KPIs simultaneously? Thanks for the question, Christine. They essentially, just as Scrum and OKRs, for example, with the project level and execution level, very neatly dock or connect. KPIs, the way most organizations would define them, and they're not, there's no perfect way to define where KPIs start and end, but the way KPIs are used in most organizations, they're used as either business level KPIs, so like what's the business impact, or like kind of things to track how things are running in operations. And what is mostly referred to is the business impact. So we are making revenue, our net promoter score is good, and all those things, right? Or you have a great margin or EBIT. And those are things that are still going to be super important, right? Because you care about that business impact. You just started adding the customer focus, right? You started adding with OKRs, what are the things we're trying to achieve to drive customer value, and then subsequently drive business value. And that business value can be measured in KPIs. And you can not only contribute to other OKRs with the OKR, but you can also relate to your KPIs on a team level or organizational level for that fact. And what I would very much like to do is share some follow-up material on that. So we have kind of visualizations on how those work together, and also like kind of a worksheet or explanation sheet. So maybe Teresa, we can take that also as a follow-up. All right, so I think we went through all of the questions, and I would, for now, I would very much thank you for joining today. You will receive a follow-up email with the video recording, the presentation slides, as well as additional, material that you can use to run your OKR process. And I would also very kindly ask you to share feedback. So we're trying to improve the webinars, and Teresa just shared a link in the chat that you should be able to see to get feedback on this webinar. So very much appreciated. We would like to continue running these. You can share what you like to hear, what type of topics, but also like what could we do better in terms of this webinar. You will also receive this link in the email, and we would very much appreciate it.